Welcome to Natu Reads, an audio library of revolutionary texts. For a Unified Maoist International Conference. Proposal regarding the balance of the international communist movement and of its current general political line. Part 2. Three. International situation. Starting from the thesis of Lenin, it is estimated that the economic relations of imperialism constitute the basis of the currently existing international situation. Throughout the whole 20th century, this new phase of capitalism, its superior and last stage, was completely defined, and that the division of the whole world into oppressed and oppressor countries is a distinctive feature of imperialism. Thus, to understand the current situation, we cannot start from the fundamental contradiction of capitalism because we are in its superior and last phase, imperialism. There are three fundamental contradictions in today's world. First contradiction. Between oppressed nations, on the one hand, and imperialist superpowers and powers on the other. This is the principal contradiction in the current moment, and, at the same time, the principal contradiction of the epoch. The world is divided. In one part, there is a big number of oppressed nations, which are colonial or semi-colonial countries. The latter have only formal sovereignty or independence. They are economically, politically, and culturally subjugated to imperialism. In the other part, there is a handful of imperialist powers, superpowers or powers. In both cases, they are oppressing nations. In the part of the imperialist powers, Yankee imperialism is the sole hegemonic superpower. Russia is still an atomic superpower, and there is a handful of second-tier imperialist powers. Yankee imperialism is the largest exporter of capital in the world, which is expressed in enormous imbalance in its economy. In order to keep its hegemony, imperialism is forced to carry out many wars at the same time, despite having military presence in all continents. This leads to enormous economic costs for maintaining its huge military machinery and espionage, the costs of the credits from the past wars and the current wars, support for the war veterans, not to mention the high social cost that is caused in their own land, hatred for the life and dignity of the masses from the oppressed nations, Third World, the genocide they apply to subjugate them, which nourishes class hatred from all the peoples of the world. The Third World hosts the largest and poorest population. They are subject to imperialist oppression. They live in conditions that do not fit the level of development achieved by humanity. They suffer the demise of their living conditions, of the natural environment, and they are stricken by the systematic wars of plunder of imperialism and their local lackeys. A bureaucratic capitalism develops on a semi-feudal and semi-colonial basis in these countries. It generates the corresponding political and ideological genres and systematically prevents national development, exploits the proletariat, the peasantry, and the petty bourgeoisie, and restricts the medium bourgeoisie. Not acknowledging the semi-feudal character of the oppressed countries, and, thus, the necessity for an agrarian war to solve it, ends up denying the necessity of the democratic revolution in those countries, the necessity to develop the People's War as a unitary war, in which the countryside is principal and the city is a necessary complementary, to end with imperialism, bureaucratic capitalism, and semi-feudality. World crisis will go on unloading on the oppressed countries, and as long as they hold this condition, they will still be the loot for the imperialist repartition. The policy of imperialism is further reaction and violence against the oppressed nations for a further national subjugation of wars of plunder and prey. The plan of the imperialists is the partition of the countries in the new repartition, based on the relations of military force and the advance of the occupation of strategic positions. What they seek is not peace, but to subjugate the peoples through capitulation with, quote, peace agreements, end quote, which they only formalize what they achieved in the battlefield. The countries of the Third World, from Asia, Africa, and Latin America, as pointed out by Chairman Mao, are the zones of revolutionary storms and the base for the world proletarian revolution. It is necessary to highlight that the Third World extends even to Europe itself. We reaffirm that the true national self-determination can only be achieved through revolution of a new democracy or socialist revolution, according to each case, through the development of the People's War, to which it is necessary to constitute or reconstitute communist parties of a new type, Marxist-Leninist-Maoist parties, capable of leading revolution to its end. Chairman Mao has masterly synthesized all the struggles in the oppressed nations at the following great guideline. Quote, "The countries want their sovereignty, the nations want their liberation, and the peoples want revolution." End quote. Second contradiction. Between proletariat and bourgeoisie in the imperialist countries. The economic crisis in 2008, that began as a finance crisis in the USA, was unloaded over the masses in the imperialist countries themselves and in the oppressed nations. Thus, it has stricken the proletariat of the imperialist countries, which instigated sharp struggles for the defense of the achievements they conquered throughout the 20th century. The consequences of this crisis were not overcome. This is why the recovery of employment is at the expense of worse quality, lower wages, and a longer working day. The recovery is at the expense of increasing the overexploitation of the class. The proletariat-bourgeoisie contradiction is also worsened as a result of the migratory waves of thousands of war refugees and general poor people who, fleeing from the imperialist war and the ferocious exploitation and oppression in the semi-colonies, are thickening the ranks of the proletariat in the imperialist countries. These migratory waves are a consequence of the system itself, and the quote, humanitarian tragedy, end quote, which they are leading, benefits the monopolies in the imperialist countries by reducing the production cost due to reducing the salaries of the working force that has cost nothing to them. At the same time, the imperialists themselves cynically broadcast in their media the danger of, quote, terrorism, end quote, of those immigrants and promote chauvinist hysteria, nourish racism and nationalism. Imperialism applies its chauvinist reactionary policy of dividing the class between native workers and immigrant workers to prevent the united class conscious action of the proletariat, to prevent it from organizing itself as a single class with the same interests, with a single ideology, a single politics, and a single party, the Communist Party. The contradiction in the imperialist countries is also between revolution and counter-revolution. It is not a question of changing this or that political regime. In other words, the form of government of the bourgeois dictatorship, but to put an end on the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie over the proletariat and the people through socialist revolution, which is carried out through People's War. The bourgeoisie-proletariat contradiction and all the other contradictions within the imperialist nations are sharpening. Also, because all the kinds of infamies that are carried out by the imperialist states against the oppressed nations, particularly by USA imperialism, increasingly backlash within the imperialist countries themselves. This is a feature of the current phase of its decomposition. The imperialist war has necessarily to return home. Furthermore, in their own land, the systematic and continuous murder of the members of the poorest masses by the repressive forces of the Yankee state are part of the war against the U.S. proletariat and people, particularly against the black and immigrant populations from the Third World and their descendants. Facing oppression, the tendency is that the masses uprise in rebellion and turn the guns that they were given for the massive genocide in the oppressed nations against their own oppressors. The expressions that confirm such tendencies have already taken place. Summing up, the principle is that the movement against the imperialist war will grow, together with the rebellion against the exploitation and oppression of the class and the increasing poverty of the masses. This is taking place in all imperialist countries. Third contradiction. Inter-imperialist. Just as Lenin taught us, imperialism is not one. There are different imperialist countries. In other words, there are imperialist powers and superpowers which divide the world among themselves according to their relations of economic, political, and military strength. Relations of strength that change all the time and develop through collusion and contend with each other. The United States currently bears the condition of sole hegemonic superpower. After the disintegration of the social imperialist USSR in 1991, the economic weight of imperialist Russia was reduced, and so was their military power, but it still maintains its character of atomic superpower. In turn, the other imperialist powers, like Germany, England, France, Japan, China, Austria, the Netherlands, Australia, Sweden, Canada, Italy, Spain, etc., altogether are also a handful of oppressing countries. Since the decade of 1990, they are contending for a new repartition of the oppressed countries that were subjected to social imperialist USSR. Since then, all the events of some relevance, be they bellicose or non-bellicose, in Eastern Europe, in the former Soviet republics of Central Asia, the so-called amplified Middle East, the Persian Gulf, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Northern Africa, etc., are included in this contention for the new repartition of those countries. The current world situation is marked by the plan of Yankee imperialism to develop its war of aggression through blood and fire. Their main strategic objective is to snatch the condition of atomic superpower from Russia, hold down social imperialist China, and push it to opening its economy bit by bit. Alliances with other imperialist powers are used for that purpose, according to convenience, as with Germany, France, England, etc., to subvert order in the zones of influence that have a high strategic value for Russia and impose economic sanctions as a threat to all imperialist powers. In its turn, Russia makes efforts to maintain its zones of influence, especially in Ukraine, Syria, and Iran. As for the imperialists, be they alone or in coalitions, they are against one oppressed country or many of those countries from the Third World. At this moment, not only the principal contradiction expresses itself, but also the third contradiction is expressed, among the imperialists themselves. Yankee imperialism uses, quote, divide and rule, end quote, against other imperialist powers. The imperialists violate, as they wish, their own treaties, their own international rules, the principle of non-aggression, because the law is for others to follow. This is why peace and harmony between imperialists are old stories told again, as those of, quote, super-imperialism, end quote, and, quote, ultra-imperialism, end quote, which spread reactionary concepts such as, quote, neo-imperialism, end quote, neocolonialism, end quote, neoliberalism, end quote, globalization, end quote, geopolitics, end quote, etc. Those are pseudo-theories that mainly point against democratic revolution and the struggles for national liberation, and are used by both imperialists themselves and by revisionists. Imperialist dispute and absolute, and imperialist collusion are relative. This determines the circumstantial and temporary character of the imperialist alliances. This is why one cannot speak about, quote, imperialist blocs, end quote. This is revisionism. Thus, the European Union is not a bloc, or a, quote, European imperialism, end quote, but an alliance of countries of Europe, under hegemony of Germany, in contention and collusion with France, that tries to increase its power to stop Yankee imperialism. The imperialist powers of the second tier struggled to convert themselves into new superpowers and start contending for world hegemony to occupy the place that is today displayed by Yankee imperialism, and to impose, through a new world war, a new repartition of the world that is already divided into a new world order. Regarding the contradiction between socialism and capitalism, which corresponds to the whole era of the world proletarian revolution in the current situation, is expressed and develops in the ideological and historical terrain. From the terrain of the reaction, this contradiction manifests itself as the general counter-revolutionary offensive, which is weakening and is currently pointed against the national liberation wars through so-called, quote, wars against terrorism, end quote. We oppose it with the Marxist-Leninist-Maoist revolutionary counteroffensive, which develops with People's War. In the terrain of revolution, the contradiction between socialism and capitalism expresses itself in that socialism lives as an idea in the struggles of the proletariat and the peoples of the world, in the ongoing combats and people's wars in India, Peru, Turkey, and the Philippines, and the restless propaganda and increasing two-line struggles among the Marxist-Leninist-Maoist parties and organizations for unifying the ICM under the guidance of Maoism and the application of People's War. In 1962, Chairman Mao indicated, quote, the next 50 to 100 years or so, as of today, will be a great epoch of radical change of the social system of the world, an epoch that will shake the earth, an epoch with which no other previous historical epoch can be compared. Living in such an epoch, we must be ready to fight a great struggle whose forms will have many different characteristics from the past." End quote. All of that, on the one hand, impulses the greater reactionarization of the bourgeois state, big landowner bureaucratic states serving imperialism in the oppressed countries, to counter the revolutionary situation and uneven development in the whole world. Its expression is the advance towards the absolute centralization of power in the executive, be it as presidential absolutism or as fascism, according to the particularities of the different countries. The centralization of power to face revolution and for the imperialist war of aggression. The objective situation at world level develops, fundamentally, as a worsening of the general crisis of imperialism, which even the reaction itself needs to acknowledge. It is the deepening of its collapse. The huge richness that is socially produced incessantly grows as the private appropriation of such richness is done by a handful of imperialists and the big bourgeois and landowners of the third world. The result of all this is sharper crisis and shorter cycles within the general and last crisis of imperialism, which pushes all the imperialist states to wage wars of prey for a new repartition. Just as Chairman Mao pointed out in 1958, quote, "Imperialism is still alive, and Yankee imperialism, as the sole hegemonic superpower and counter-revolutionary world gendarme, is the principal enemy of the peoples of the world. It still does as it pleases in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. It still occupies colonies by force, establishes its military bases in all parts of the world, and imposes a war of plunder. It continues to oppress the people's masses in its own country." End quote. All that is even more acute now, 60 years later. But the same situation is also becoming further unbearable, and it is inevitable that sooner or later, more than 90% of the world population will rise against imperialism and the reactionaries. All that in fierce struggle and in uneven development, it is already going on as a new great wave of the world proletarian revolution. Since the beginning of this epoch, the crisis of imperialism and bureaucratic capitalism sharpens in the whole world. Whenever its decomposition deepens, all the contradictions sharpen, which develops further the revolutionary situation and uneven development in the whole world. This situation is expressed by the great activity of the masses. Its explosiveness makes all reactionaries and their revisionist lackeys tremble. It is expressed everywhere in great explosions never seen before. The objective situation meets at fast pace with a subjective factor, principally the process of the communist parties, as Marxist-Leninist-Maoist, principally Maoist parties of a new type, to initiate new people's wars. Thus a new moment opens, a period of revolutions, as part of this new great wave of the world proletarian revolution, within the period of the, quote, 50 to 100 years, end quote, which includes the strategic offensive of the world revolution. This situation determines the tasks, the strategy, and the tactics of the communist parties in the whole world. 4. International Communist Movement. We reaffirm ourselves in the full validity of the Manifesto of the Communist Party from 1848, including all its preface and notes written by Marx and Engels, especially the preface of 1872, which is the start of the birth and cornerstone of the international communist movement. It established the fundamental principles and the program of the proletarian revolutionaries. Given that our great founders, Marx and Engels, made that great calling and lemma, quote, "Proletarians of all countries, unite," end quote, that lemma for combat inspires the struggles of the proletariat in the whole world, and guides through the path of emancipation. The flames of revolution that were started by Marx and Engels have set the world on fire, permanently changing the course of world history. Marx said, quote, "The experience of the past teaches us that forgetting the fraternal ties that must exist between the workers of the different countries and that should encourage them to support each other in all their struggles for emancipation is punished by common defeat of all its isolated efforts," end quote. Lenin established that true proletarian internationalism requires, quote, "first, the subordination of the interests of the proletarian struggle in a country to the interests of this struggle on the world scale. Second, that the nation that is reaching the triumph over the bourgeoisie is capable and willing to make the greatest national sacrifices for the overthrow of international capital." End quote. Chairman Mao raised internationalism in its deepest sense when affirming, quote, "It is the spirit of communism." End quote. Thus, the history of the international communist movement is a glorious process of struggle, through which the communists of the world have struggled and struggle to unify themselves, serving the achievement of the unalterable goal, the communist society. 3 internationals were built in this heroic struggle. The First International, or International Workers' Association, IWA, was founded by Marx and Engels in 1864, in a fierce struggle against the anarchists, the Blanquists, and other positions to establish that the ideology of the proletariat was only one, Marxism. It is solid and is scientifically welded with the international nature of the proletariat and its revolutionary party, laid the ideological basis of the proletarian revolution. The moment the International was infiltrated and surrounded by opportunists who attempted to usurp it, Marx put forward that it would be better to end with the IWA than to see it murdered by unity without principles. The Second International, based on Marxism, was founded by Engels in 1889 and served the multiplication of workers' socialist organizations and parties, especially in Europe and North America. After the death of Engels, Bernstein's and Kautsky's revisionism assaulted the leadership of the Second International, and it degenerated into opportunism. It was finally bankrupt during the First World War, when their leaders opposed themselves to struggle against the imperialist war under the pretext of, quote, defensism, defense of the motherland. They refused to turn it into revolution. They supported the imperialist war and the bourgeoisie of their countries. They voted for the credits of war at the parliament, turned into social traitors, social chauvinists. The founding of the Third International in March 1919 was the result of a long struggle by the left of the ICM that was developed under the great leadership of Lenin and the Bolshevik Party, and featured a struggle against all revisionism and opportunism of the member parties of the Second International, who were adapted to the old order. Lenin conceived and funded the Third International as a war machine to carry out the world proletarian revolution and the construction of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The founding of the Third International constitutes a great leap in the history of the international communist movement. The Third International, Communist International, CI or Comintern, existed for 24 years. 7 world congresses were held during that time until its dissolution in 1943. It had to develop in a complex context represented by the loss of its founder and principal leader, the great Lenin, in 1924, the great challenges of the construction of socialism in the USSR, the rise of fascism to power in many countries of the world, especially in Europe, and the beginning of the Second World War. Its existence was strongly influenced by the intense and hard two-line struggle that was developed within the Bolshevik Party, which lasted 13 years, in which the left, under the leadership of Comrade Stalin, had to tenaciously struggle to unmask and smash Trotskyism, Bukharism, and the right opportunist clique of Kamenev-Zinoviev, among other gangs and black lines, against the efforts to undermine the dictatorship of the proletariat in the USSR, their attempts to usurp the leadership of the CI, and controlling apparatuses to impose their policies in many sections, nefarious actions that caused grave harm. Because of that, the CI suffered right and quote left and quote deviations, particularly within the period between the 5th and the 7th Congresses, and has issued some erroneous advices and directives that caused some harm to revolutionary parties and processes. However, the principle was that Comrade Stalin led, developing the two-line struggle, the left within the Communist International, preventing the revisionist usurpation and smashed the Trotskyist and Zinovievist influence at its leadership. Under the correct and justified leadership of Comrade Stalin, it kept its red color, Marxism-Leninism prevailed, and revisionism could not raise its head. The 7th Congress in 1935 was of particular transcendence due to the circumstances of the moment and the challenges it faced. This important Congress had to answer to new and far-reaching problems in the midst of a difficult and complex situation. The 7th Congress established the tactic of World Anti-Fascist Front and People's Front to defend the dictatorship of the proletariat and develop the proletarian revolution, while combating the counter-revolutionary offensive of fascism. With that, for the first time in the history of the ICM, the international proletariat and the people's masses of the whole world could be united under the same flag, the same policy, the same plan, and under the same leadership, with a single combating army, providing shape for Lenin's task of working as a true war machine for the world revolution. Under his leadership, hundreds of millions of masses have risen as a great torrent of steel against fascism, for revolution, and in defense of the USSR. The Chinese Revolution stands out, which changed the correlation of forces in the struggle against imperialism and the reaction worldwide, favoring socialism in the proletariat and oppressed peoples. Under the leadership of the Third International, in dozens of countries, not only in Europe but also in Asia, the communists carried out heroic armed struggles as guerrilla warfare, like in the Spanish Civil War. In those countries in which revolution could not triumph, the cause for that was principally because there was not sufficiently mature and prepared communist parties, based on Marxism-Leninism. Despite that, as history shows, its struggle contributed to the defeat of fascism, and the communists have shown to the whole world the communist high valor and heroism, not allowing the morale of the class to be broken. By applying the resolutions of the 7th Congress, the CPCH, led by Chairman Mao, knew how to carry out the front policy specified to the necessities of revolution in China, applying independence and self-decision, defeating Japanese fascism, and continuing with the liberation war until seizing power in the whole country, defeating the local ruling classes and their imperialist masters, and completing the revolution of a new democracy, uninterruptedly going to socialist revolution. The creative application of Marxism-Leninism and the line established by the 7th Congress to the concrete practice of the Chinese Revolution led to the development of a more comprehensive and complete understanding of United Front and fully developing the military theory of the proletariat, People's War. The problems and deviations that took place in many countries were principally in application. The main responsibility falls to the communist parties, who are the responsible ones for the application of the international line to their respective countries. Departing from what was put forward by Chairman Mao, in order to establish a justified assessment of this experience, it is necessary to draw a clear demarcation line between those who are still within Marxism from those who fell into revisionism. Still in the former group, we need to differentiate the mistakes of principles from the mistakes made within the practical work. Furthermore, Chairman Mao develops the 5 laws of the United Front and regarding the 3 fundamental instruments of revolution and their interrelation. In some countries, like Italy and France, due to the right opportunist positions of the leadership of the communist parties, after carrying out armed struggle of heroic resistance against Nazi fascism, these parties moved away from the orientations of the CI and the fundamental principles of Marxism-Leninism. Their leadership capitulated before the bourgeoisie, while centering in the defense of the demo-liberal regime and betrayed revolution, degenerating into a most extreme and rotten revisionism. At a world level, under the leadership of Comrade Stalin, the anti-fascist front was brilliantly applied. The center was the defense of the dictatorship of the proletariat, represented by the USSR. Through that, the dictatorship of the proletariat faced fascism and world revolution advanced. The victory of the anti-fascist war was a victory of socialism, a victory of the international proletariat and the oppressed peoples of the world over imperialism and world reaction, a victory of Marxism-Leninism over revisionism. With the victory of the anti-fascist war, the imperialist camp was weakened, and the proletarian revolution grew stronger. Thanks to the glorious role of the Red Army and the wars of resistance, revolution has expanded throughout Eastern Europe and Central Europe, reaching part of Germany, thus increasing the socialist camp. Remarkably, with the victory of the Chinese Revolution in 1949, the correlation of forces between revolution and counter-revolution at the international arena changed in favor of world revolution, which advanced into the stage of strategic stalemate, a powerful socialist camp and a powerful movement of national liberation in the colonies and semi-colonies emerged. This is why we consider that the 7th Congress was an important Marxist-Leninist Congress that armed the proletariat with a justified and correct political line to fight fascism and advance with a world proletarian revolution. although the Communist International and Comrade Stalin made some mistakes on the course, the problems of grave deviations and betrayals were caused by revisionism in the leadership of those parties, and cannot be credited to Comrade Stalin, the CPSU, or the Communist International. When gleaning the history of the ICM and the proletarian revolution, we see that Comrade Stalin knew how to firmly and ingeniously apply, in the midst of a complex and difficult situation, the definition of Lenin of true proletarian internationalism, and to subject the particular and national interests to the interests of the international proletariat as a whole, putting the defense of the world proletarian revolution and the cause of communism in first place. In 1943, the CI self-dissolved, and the ICM entered a period of relative dispersion, which was principally generated by the splittist and treacherous action of contemporary revisionism. Modern, or contemporary revisionism, was a counter-current represented by Browder, Tito, Togliatti, Doré, and principally Khrushchev in the infamous 20th Congress of the CPSU, where his clique usurped the leadership of the CPSU, degenerating it into a revisionist party and destroying the dictatorship of the proletariat, undermining the basic principles of the unity of the international communist movement. The task of the communists to unify at world level, after the Second World War and the death of Comrade Stalin, was done in a fierce struggle against contemporary revisionism, in which Chairman Mao rises as a growing great leader of the world revolution. In 1957 and 1960, two international conferences of communist parties and workers' parties take place in Moscow. The declarations of these two conferences correspond to the development of the two-line struggle in the ICM at that moment, considering the big weight that the CPSU had, and reflected the correct handling of the struggle done by the left led by Chairman Mao and the CPCH, applying the principle of acting with reason, advantage, and not exceeding. The 22nd Congress of the CPSU was held in 1961, which systematized the positions of modern revisionism in it. Chairman Mao, leading the Communist Party of China, defined the essence of new revisionism, which he systematized in the quote, 3 peacefuls, end quote, and the quote, 2 wholes, end quote. Khrushchev distorted Lenin's thesis of peaceful coexistence, which differentiates the relations between states from those within the states, to put forward a quote, peaceful coexistence, end quote, as a general line for the international communist movement. For Khrushchev, the problem was to avoid war, because, according to him, the atomic weapons did not distinguish exploited from exploiters, which was why men had to join each other in order to prevent disappearance of humanity. The quote, peaceful transition, end quote, put forward that revolution did not need revolutionary violence, but one could replace a social system with another through the quote, peaceful way, end quote, through elections, through parliamentarism. As for the quote, peaceful emulation, end quote, they defended that in order to destroy the imperialist system, the socialist system should make an emulation to show the imperialists that the socialist system was superior, and thus the imperialist would change into socialism. The revisionist thesis of the quote, state of the whole people, end quote, was meant to deny the class character of the state, and was concretely against the dictatorship of the proletariat. The quote, party of the whole people, end quote, is another machination that denied the class character of the party as a party of the proletariat. Thus, Khrushchev advocated that the 22nd Congress of the CPSU was the new program of the communists and substituted the Communist Manifesto with the bourgeois lemma of, quote, liberty, equality, and fraternity, end quote. On June 14, 1963, the, quote, proposition on the general line of the international communist movement, end quote, also known as the, quote, Chinese letter, end quote, followed by the, quote, 9 comments, end quote, were released, in which Chairman Mao and the CPCH brilliantly unmasked and smashed contemporary revisionism in all its facets. Only with the deep demarcation produced by the Great Polemic, led by Chairman Mao and the Communist Party of China, the international communist movement was able to raise the process of reunification around the great leadership of Chairman Mao and his contributions to the world proletarian revolution. Chairman Mao developed this struggle simultaneously to the struggle against the right opportunist line within the CPCH, which had usurped important apparatuses of the party and the state. Chairman Mao and the CPCH considered that, in such circumstances, it was not adequate to conform a new communist international, because the ideological and political basis, which should be Marxism-Leninism-Mao Zedong thought then, was not defined. Particularly, the Workers' Party of Albania, led by Enver Hoxha, did not accept Mao Zedong thought and wanted an international solely based on Marxism-Leninism, without considering the new development that it had, because essentially, Hoxha was opposed to Mao Zedong thought. With the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution in China, the influence of Chairman Mao increasingly develops throughout the world. The CPCH centers on very urgent problems, such as recovering power in the People's Republic of China from the revisionist usurpation of Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, and on how to continue revolution under the dictatorship of the proletariat. In that way, within the national and international class struggle against revisionism, Chairman Mao is converted into the great master of the proletariat and into the great leader of the world revolution, and his thought turns into the third stage of Marxism, even though the struggle for its definition and acknowledgement would only be given later. The UMIC is a step of great importance in that same path. Chairman Mao dies on September 1976, and the Chinese revisionists make a counter-revolutionary coup, attacking Chairman Mao and his thought. Thus, the unity of the Marxists entered into grave and complex problems. With the death of Chairman Mao and the revisionist usurpation in China by Deng and his accomplices, we communists became dispersed in the world, without a center nor a base for the world revolution. Counter-revolution has shown its claws to deny Chairman Mao in the validity of Marxism-Leninism-Mao thought, and unleashed the triple revisionist attack of Deng Xiaoping, Chinese revisionism, Hoxha, Albanian revisionism, and Brezhnev, Russian revisionism. The counter-revolutionary coup in China 1976 opened a new period of deep dispersion in the ICM, on which a general counter-revolutionary offensive was unleashed by Yankee imperialism that centrally and mainly centered its attack to snatch the soul of revolution, its ideology, Marxism-Leninism-Maoism, principally Maoism. In the fall of 1980, 13 communist parties and organizations signed a declaration, quote, to the Marxist-Leninists, the workers, and the oppressed of all countries, end quote, which called the communists to unite around Marxism-Leninism and uphold Chairman Mao, but not considering it a new stage, thus not having universal validity, a work that was mainly conducted by the Revolutionary Communist Party USA. In 1984, its second conference was held. It decided on founding the Revolutionary Internationalist Movement, RIM. In its founding declaration, it was affirmed that it was guided by Marxism-Leninism-Mao thought. The RIM meant a step forward in the path of reunification. This is why it is necessary to make a correct and justified evaluation of this experience. For that, it is necessary to analyze the process of the two-line struggle within the RIM and the role that each party played. Like all revolutionary bodies, the left, center, and right were defined within the development of the two-line struggle in its core. In the decade of the 1980s, the Communist Party of Peru, PCP, under the great leadership of Chairman Gonzalo, upheld, defended, and applied Maoism as the third, new, and superior stage of Marxism in the international communist movement. The principal contribution of Chairman Gonzalo to the international communist movement was having defined Maoism in a complete and scientific way by upholding, defending, and applying it with the initiation and development of the People's War in Peru, which was initiated in May 17, 1980. This event was of fundamental importance for the world proletarian revolution in the international communist movement because it has proven the validity of Maoism and the People's War. After his heroic fall on September 11, 2021, murdered after resisting for 29 years in absolute isolation in the dungeons of imperialism and reaction, his name was permanently inscribed in the gallery of the great titans of the international proletariat. Through the action of the PCP within the RIM, it went as far as acknowledging Maoism as a new stage of Marxism in 1993. The RIM lasted a little more than 20 years from its foundation in 1984 until it went into liquidation in 2006 by the treason of Prachanda to the People's War in Nepal, and the pretension of the RCP USA of making this body be subjected to the revisionist, quote, new synthesis, end quote, of Avakian. Its formal dissolution was made in 2012. Its existence reflected the two-line struggle in the international communist movement. The RIM served the world proletarian revolution and the task of struggling for the reunification of the communists when the left, in hard struggle, was able to maintain the struggle for imposing Maoism as the sole command and guide of the world revolution at its core. However, with the arrest of Chairman Gonzalo in 1992, and soon after, the blows suffered by the People's War in Peru, which have hindered the action of the left within the ICM, the RCP-USA, converging with the right opportunist line, revisionist and capitulationist, ROL, took advantage of the complex situation to attack the left and advance his petty hegemonism, first spreading the revisionist, opposed to Marxism-Leninism-Maoism, so-called, quote, new synthesis, end quote, in a hidden form, then openly. The RIM was entering into greater lack of cohesion. This was aggravated when the RCP-USA, with Avakian at its head, in partnership with Prachanda, in collusion and contention, after publishing the Declaration for a Century of People's Wars from RIM, 2000, they started to deny it, and both of them fell into the path of revisionism, increasing their attacks against Maoism. In the following years, the contention for the hegemony between both revisionist currents and figures, not only in the RIM, but at the level of the whole ICM, also the ideological, political, and organizational discohesion of the RIM was sharpening. Finally, the revisionist hegemonist positions were imposed in the committee of the RIM. As a consequence, the RIM ceased to play a positive role and degenerated, entering bankruptcy and liquidation. Today, when a new great wave of the world proletarian revolution is produced in the world with the ongoing people's wars in India, Peru, Turkey, and the Philippines, and its preparation in many other countries, with the heroic struggles of national resistance and people's resistance around the whole world emerge, when the general crisis of imperialism and its drowning are hugely intensified, it is necessary and urgent to raise the two-line struggle at the core of the ICM to a superior level, in order to establish and develop its necessary, justified, and correct general political line, and to strengthen this new great wave through the spark of revolution with people's war in many countries, and further advances wherever they are already being waged, as well as in the anti-imperialist revolutionary movement under the hegemony of the proletariat. This is why it is necessary to deepen the ideological and political struggle on the basis of the justified and correct assessment of the historical experience of the proletarian revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat in general. An assessment that particularly synthesizes the experience of the application of the third stage of Marxism, which is Maoism. The struggle to impose Marxism-Leninism-Maoism, principally Maoism, as the command and guide of the world revolution is long, complex, and difficult. Marxism has never advanced without a hard struggle, but in the end, Maoism is guiding the new great wave of the world proletarian revolution that has already started and needs to be impulsed in order to sweep away imperialism and the reaction from the face of the earth through people's war, in order to carry out democratic revolutions, socialist revolutions, and proletarian cultural revolutions, according to each case, in transition towards shining and golden communism. It is particularly necessary to keep deepening the struggle against the new revisionism and its different expressions, because although they were unmasked and smashed in the ICM, they still have influence through the right and quote left end quote opportunist positions, centrist positions, liquidationist positions, etc., and they harm the unity of the ICM as a whole, because they are the main danger to the ICM. 5. We assume the following basic principles. The contradiction. Sole fundamental law of the incessant transformation of eternal matter. The masses make history, and rebellion is justified. Class struggle, dictatorship of the proletariat, and proletarian internationalism. Integration of the universal truth of Marxism-Leninism-Maoism with the concrete practice of revolution in each country. The necessity of the Marxist-Leninist-Maoist Communist Party that firmly applies independence, self-decision, and self-reliance. Inseparably and implacably combating imperialism, revisionism, and the reaction. Conquer and defend power with people's war. Two-line struggle as an impulsing force for party development. Constant ideological transformation and always putting politics at the command. Serve the people and the world proletarian revolution. absolute selflessness, and justified and correct style of work. Going against the tide. The first Unified Maoist International Conference is a base, and inexorably marches towards the reunification of the communists in the ICM, a war machine, a machine of combat, that raises the unfading flags of Marxism-Leninism-Maoism in the invincible People's War.